Introducing the speakers for today, we are honored to have three people who were in the process when the transition happened in Tasmania. We've got Mayor Doug Chipman. He is the mayor of Clarence City Council, and he has been mayor since 2011. Prior to that, he was an elected member, a councillor there. He was the chief owner's representative of Tasmania up until just a couple of weeks ago. He is the president of Local Government Association of Tasmania and a former vice president of Australian Local Government Association. We've also got Paul West, who's a former GM, which is the equivalent of a CEO here in New Zealand at the council, and he was GM at Devonport, Kingsborough, Worth and Warrawoona Council. He was also on the board and an executive of LGP and LGMA, and a former national president of LGMA, which is similar to Taitwara and LGNZ here in New Zealand. Andrew Wardlaw, similar to Paul, was also a former GM at Burnie, King Island, and West Coast. And he was a former national president of LGPA, a former director of LGPA Tasmania, and he currently sits on multiple boards, including Burnie Airport and TAS Communications.
Thank you, Burton, and welcome to our New Zealand friends. Look, I don't want to, the first slide is in relation to the functions of government in Australia, and I'm sure our New Zealand friends is aware of it, but just to recap on a few things, obviously we are a federation made up of 6 states and 2 territories, and therefore we have 3 spheres of government, federal, state and territory, and local government. Obviously functions, each of those levels of government do have a role to play, but a lot of things that we do go across the 3 spheres of government, so I just want to talk about it briefly. Just to set the context for today. Obviously at the federal level, you have they're predominantly Medicare, social welfare, defence, immigration, foreign policy. At the state level, they look after public housing, prisons, public transport, police, fire and ambulance, power and gas. And at the local level, whilst you could say that local governments raise rates and rubbish, they also look after other things like community services, recreational and cultural facilities, town planning and building. When you look across the graph there, the diagram, you can see that roads does go across all spheres of government. We have a national highway in all states and territories. We have state highways, and then we have local roads. In education, federal predominantly look after universities. States look after the school system, high school, primary, secondary school. And in some cases, local government do early years learning in some states in Australia. Health predominantly is with the federal and state government. Federally generally look after the doctors. The states generally look after the hospitals and primary health. Libraries, there is varying levels. In Tasmania, libraries is a state responsibility. In other states, libraries are the responsibility of local government. So that is a bit of bit changes across the different states and territories in the federation. Water storage is a little bit the same. In Tasmania, obviously with Taswater, I guess water could be local government or a state entity. In some states, it is still water storage with local government. In other states, it is got a responsibility at the state level. Environment does cut across. In the later slides, we'll talk about the environment. The federal do have a hand to play in the environment in Australia, particularly around threatened species in relation to flora and fauna. Predominantly, environment's looked after by state government in Australia, but local government does look after the environment through planning laws and those sort of things. Economic development, obviously trade internationally is looked after by the federal government, but state and local government do economic development at very, very degrees throughout the federation. And then public health, I guess we all have a role across all spheres of government in public health in one way or another. Looking at tax revenue in Australia, being the 3 levels, across Australia, tax revenue collected is $552 billion. Predominantly that is collected by the federal government, 81%. State government do collect $88 billion or 16%, and local government do collect 3% or $16 billion. In relation to the federal government, predominantly that is income tax, which is 74%. Income tax could be individual income tax or company tax. Goods and services is 24%, and other revenue, the tax that the government federal government receive is 2%. State government predominantly they get their share of revenue across different streams. Payroll tax is more than a quarter, 29%. Property taxes is 16%. Goods and services is 39%, and goods and performances is 16%. Obviously, local government 3% is predominantly property rates tax. In relation to that revenue, as it all comes into the federal system, or predominantly most of it comes into the federal system, it's allocated predominantly for health and education. And these two graphs here sort of shows where the money's being spent on the top graph, and the bottom graph there is the payments that are made to the states. Because local government is a creature of the state, generally any federal grants comes through the state government. So local government in Tasmania or in Australia will get financial assistance grants, and they come through a needs basis and population basis formula into the states, and then the states distribute it to local government in each of the relative states around the federation. Obviously, you can see at the bottom graph there, half of that revenue payments coming through is coming from GST, $75 billion coming through to the states. But obviously, money for health, schools, national housing and homelessness, public housing, and other type of payments.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real honour to be able to talk to you today. From the beautiful city of Clarence in Greater Hobart. First of all, the Tas Water is regulated very strictly across all three levels of government, basically. And so there's a lot involved for a water utility. At the federal level, we've got Australian Security and Investment Commission, which obviously has some influence over the amount that can be raised in terms of resources. You've got the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. At the state level, where most of the regulation comes through, we've got the Tasmanian Economic Regulator that clearly sets the prices that can be charged and oversights with some degree of precision the economic plan and investment plans of Tas Water. The Environmental Protection Agency has a key role in terms of what Tas Water is discharging to the environment in terms of grey water, but it also gets involved in the health of the river systems, the water basins, and the source, so the inputs to Tas Water as well. Department of Health clearly sets the standards for the quality of water delivered in particular. Department of Primary Industries, Parks and Water Environment. Interesting because the water catchment areas are not owned by Tas Water, essentially, that water is shared between the electricity generators and also irrigation schemes, as well as Tas Water. So, and then of course there are local farmers who can have licenses to draw on it as well. So the water resources is very carefully controlled at a central level. And then within the workforce, clearly WorkSafe Tasmania looks after the workplace and safety regulation, and the Ombudsman's there for to deal with complaints. At the local level, apart from being owners, councils are clearly the planning authority, building permits, and also responsible for oversighting public health. The legislation that's in place, basically, which sets up the operation of Tas Water at the moment, at the federal level, there's the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which enables the regulation that comes from the federal level. And then you've got the Corporations Act, because Tas Water is set up as a corporations under corporations law. Each state and the federal government have a common code for the Corporations Act, and certainly Tas Water is set up accordingly. The directors are appointed, and their key responsibility to the shareholders is for the direction of the company as it exists. Having said that, the state legislation was enacted to facilitate the fact that Taswater is established as a corporation. We have the Water and Sewage Corporation Act, which directs the formation of the company. The Water and Sewage Industry Act, which directs its operations to some extent. And then, of course, you've got the enablers for different regulators: the Public Health Act, Land Use Planning Approvals Act, Water Management Act, Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act, and the Public Interest Disclosure Act. They all apply. At the local level, clearly you've got local planning schemes, Taswater's constitution itself. The company constitution is signed off by and can only be amended by the owners, which of course make up 29 councils plus a 10% share by the state government. And the shareholders, the owners, also have a considerable influence over the direction of the board's operations through a shareholders' letter of expectations, which can only be amended by the owners. But usually, and we've only just last month signed off on an amended shareholders' letter of expectation. That was worked up in consultation between the owners and the board to ensure that there's a common understanding there. I might add that the owners have an expert advisory group, which is comprised of a couple of the key chief financial officers from the major councils, a couple of general managers. It's chaired by the chief owner's representative, and that expert advisory group is supported by the Local Government Association of Tasmania to provide the secretariat for that. So the owners have the horsepower, if you like, to operate intelligently in terms of how they deal with the corporation and the board.
Thanks, Doug, and good morning, everybody. The process to get to the reform, though, it takes a lot of work. And so some of the issues that we had to deal with in Tasmania as part of the process when we went through water reform back in 2009 is that there was about a 3-year lead up to it. But the things that need to be considered as part of that process is you've obviously got people issues. You're going to have to transfer some of your staff, which then results in potentially organisational restructures for the balance of the people who are staying within your organisation. In Tasmania, it was generally agreed that if somebody spent more than 60% of their time in the water and sewerage area, that they would be transferred to the new water authorities. If they spent less than 60% of their time, then they were further reviewed, and there was some consideration that was taken as to whether they did transfer or whether they didn't. A lot of the issues around who transferred and who didn't is a matter for the council to determine. And so it is the council who actually understands what their people do and how best that they can keep their entities basically operating after reform, and determine who are the best people to transfer into the water authority, but also who are the best people to keep within your own structures. The asset transfers, so you've got land, building, plant, headworks, reserves, all of those things. You need to make sure that there are really good asset registers, and that you don't transfer things that you don't have to. And so it's really important as part of the lead up to the water reforms is to make sure that you are very clear as to what assets are transferring, what assets need to be reconsidered for transfer. And what I mean by that is, as an example, in Tasmania, where I was working at the time, we had a large area of land that was surrounding our sewage treatment plant. The council determined that it didn't require to transfer all of that land to the new water authority. So we actually went through a subdivision process to make sure that we kept a large area of that land in council ownership. And that's not a 5-minute task. So therefore, it's not something that can be left to the last minute. So you need to be planning now to say, what is it you need to do? What do we need to, actions do we need to take to make sure that you only actually transfer assets that are legitimately required for the continued operation of the water and sewage services. From a financial perspective, you obviously have issues around your balance sheet. You need, once again, that's where the assets and liabilities come in, so it will have an impact on your balance sheet. Also your employee provisions, so you need to closely look at your employee provisions, because any provisions that you have in relation to annual leave, not sure in your case as to what happens with sick leave, but in Tasmania, there was some obligation from the councils to transfer some sick leave benefits, long service leave. That all needs to be calculated and be prepared and ready for transfer when the new entities are created. And all of this obviously has an impact on your profit and loss. And so there are issues that you need to consider there about your long-term financial plans, how that all factors in. The systems and processes, we needed to consider planning and building referrals, what happens with capital works. So in our case, what was once a one-stop shop for approvals, now as of the when the new water authority commenced, we had to then be prepared to have an additional referral process, and we had to work out a process for how we were going to deal with that, because there's a guarantee that on day one of the new water authorities that you're still going to have developers coming into your council offices wanting to submit planning applications, and so therefore you need to be well advanced and understand what it is that you're going to be doing and how you're going to actually still continue to provide those services. What did we do in Tasmania to prepare for transition? So it was a fairly involved process, and there was a state government task force that had been created. That was a ministerial task force, and they were basically the oversight. That was the government making sure that its water reforms were implemented in the manner in which they wanted it to be done. To achieve the transfer and the process, the state government, there was actually a steering committee that was created that was made up of state government representatives, but also local government. And it was actually chaired by the president of the Local Government Association. And so that was the steering committee that actually was put in place to make sure that the whole process and that was run smoothly, but also that there was communication going between both the councils, the government, and the new entities that were being created. As part of that, and we'll talk a bit more about it further on, there was implementation joint steering committee, there was a operational readiness group, there was local government, regional government structures. So there was a lot of process that was put in place to make sure that we could achieve the reform in the best way that we could in the shortest time frame that we could. The task force priorities were on ensuring that the sector operated on an appropriate commercial basis. The implementation joint steering committee, as I said, they had a key role in managing the implementation. The operational readiness coordination group, they looked at the new structures and the new corporations and developed appropriate organisation structures, established the required startup and those type of things. There was some funding that was actually provided by the state government to fund the new corporations early on to ensure that they could actually start to operate even before the water and sewage was transferred to them. And then there was obviously the local government regional groupings. And it was important from our perspective that we actually worked together with other councils, because it wasn't just our assets and liabilities and our employees that was transferring over. Every council was in the same position. And we had different varying sizes of councils. And so it was important that the larger councils actually shouldered a heavier load, I suppose, to make sure that it supported its neighbours and because it was in all of our interests to make sure that this water reform actually worked. And so therefore, that was something that we were very keen to see happen, and that the various local governments all work together. The government also engaged an independent arbitrator, and that was funded through the government, and so they would then make sure that if there was any disputes, the independent arbitrator would then deal with that. From my recollection, I don't believe that there was any call for the independent arbitrator to actually be involved. I think it was generally done as smoothly, but also as cooperatively as possible. So this is a bit of the transition plan. This was our experience. And so the timeline across there in 2006, we were advised the Premier had the state address and advised that he had established a ministerial task force to review water and sewage services and the delivery of water and sewage in Tasmania. So that was the first we were aware of it, and that was around about the end of 2006. By December 2007, the ministerial task force had done their work, and the Treasurer advised that the status quo would not continue. So at that stage, we were, as local government, that was when we knew that it was going to change. There'd been a lot of debate between December 2006 and December 2007. Councils were trying to resist the change and giving all the reasons why it probably shouldn't happen. But come December 2007, the Treasurer clearly said it is going to change, and the status quo won't be continuing. In 2008, the Water and Sewerage Industry Act passed Parliament, and that was then by December 2008, so just 12 months after the Treasurer said it's not continuing the way it was, the due diligence reports had been completed, and they were commissioned by the state government, which basically just outlined where the process was at, what was going to occur, the fact that there was going to be 3 regional authorities in Tasmania plus a common service provider. That had been a lot of the argy-bargy that had gone on between the local government sector and the state government. The state government's preference was one authority for the whole state. Local government preferred the regional model. And I suppose in some respects, local government got its way in relation to that. And so therefore, the model that was implemented at the beginning of the process was just the 3 regional models plus the common service provider. So in December 2008, we were at the stage where this was all happening, and essentially we had 6 months to get it finalised. And so from January onwards, January through to June 2009, all councils had to provide a monthly report provided to the steering committee as to where they were at in their transition planning and processes. We received as councils the draft transfer orders provided by the state government, which was basically the transfer orders were indicating what was transferring and the values that were being placed on the assets and those sort of things. They were provided to councils in February 2009. We had to provide our comments back on those and submit them formally to Treasury by April 2009. So we had 2 months. And then during that period, we're also finalising our shareholders' letters of expectation, which is because councils in Tasmania have a shareholding impact. That was basically just explaining what the arrangements would be, what the shareholders expected the new companies to provide for them in relation to water and sewage. In June 2009, the transfer orders were approved by the Treasurer. I think from memory that was about the 15th of June. And then the new corporations commenced on the 1st of July. So it was a very tight time frame. There was a lot of work that was undertaken, and it was certainly something that required a lot of cooperation, collaboration between all the councils, the entities. All the players had to be very much involved in this. one of the things that was also guaranteed as part of our transition plan was that no employee would lose their job, either from a council perspective or from a water and sewage perspective as a result of the water and sewage reforms for at least a 12-month period. And so we're all in a position where if there was a need to review our structures and whatever else, we were still required to maintain our employee numbers for at least a 12-month period before we could even consider any sort of redundancies. Based on what we understand the situation is in New Zealand at the present time, you can see in December 2007, Tasmania was in the position where you are essentially now, that the Three Waters is underway. The government has said that this is happening. And you've got until July 2024 when the new corporations will commence. You've actually got an extra 12 months over what we had from the time that we were advised that it was happening, whether we wanted it to or not. And so you do have the extra 12 months. But some of the things that I think is important now is that when we did our reform, we didn't have COVID. And all the added issues that has played out over the last 12 or 18 months. You're also going through a local government reform process. We didn't have that at the same time. And my understanding is there's a number of other reforms that are currently occurring in New Zealand as well that requires local government to have some view. So we were probably in a better position to be able to do what we needed to do in a shorter time frame. But I think from my perspective, it would have been nice to have had a bit of extra time. And so therefore, my encouragement to you is to not waste that time and actually get in and get started with preparing yourselves for what will eventually occur in July 2024.
As you can see from Paul's earlier couple of slides, there's a lot of governance happening, will need to happen in New Zealand, and while it's not real clear what that is, you can certainly be ensured that it's going to require a lot of input from each individual councils. And I believe that CEOs need to start thinking about that internally now and looking at how it's going to get itself best positioned to be able to provide information at the relevant stages through this process. While not every council in Tasmania would have followed a model like this, it would have been something similar depending on their organisation structures, but there is a real need to consider an internal working group. There's probably three streams of things you need to be looking at. Obviously the corporate, the technical engineering and the people streams. Some organisations might have more or less, obviously depending on size and those sort of things, but you should start thinking about with directors and managers how you're going to start thinking about these things. And I guess it probably needs to be a risk-based approach as well. So things like what Paul talked about is, do you want to let all your land to go? Is there a reason to keep some of it? Where are all your risks and those sort of things? It really is, you need to start planning that now. So I guess the focus here is there's the strategic issues, the impacts that you need to start considering. Your strategic plan, you need to start thinking about what's in that, how that's going to look after reform, the financial impacts. Obviously, Paul spoke about the profit and loss balance sheet. The long-term financial plan needs to start thinking about what's that look like in 2024, 2025. Start thinking about that when you do your reviews of that over the next period and start understanding what the risks are and what the issues are. Obviously, records is a really big one and can't be underestimated. There's contracts, there's leases and licenses, there'll be agreements, IT solutions. A big issue for the new entity, how does it actually raise its revenue on day one? How do you get all the data across from your system to their system? That is a massive project in Tasmania. It probably was 12 months after the event that they had to actually rely on councils to help them collect their revenue, and there was a big issues in revenue collection in the first period. So that's a massive project that councils need to be involved in, make sure their data is reasonably good, that's going to go across, and that there's a coordinated approach to that. Operating manuals, where are they all stored? If the asset's going, Where's all the documentation for that asset and how's that going to go across? Obviously, the assets, land, buildings, plant, operating procedures need to be considered, and people, the organisational chart, start thinking about that. What does it look like post-reform? A skills audit. Paul talked about 60% and what happened in Tasmania, but what are the skills you've got? Where are the skills better placed? Do you want them to move on? Do you want them to stay? How are you going to fill the ones that go that you do use? Fill 40% of their time, and they're really critical to your organisation. What will we do when that asset does leave, or that employee does leave? And just identifying which employees. You need to start thinking about these things today, not wait until you get asked the information. Start really having a good think about that and working through how you're going to do those sort of things. I guess do not underestimate the local knowledge that's held by people. And that's really important because, one, if the people are going with that local knowledge, that could be local knowledge that you need back in your organisation, you're going to lose it. But two, they'll need that local knowledge across in their organisation about your assets too. So if the people stay behind, how they can say, it really is important that you really understand that and try and get that documented now about that local knowledge. So one, you can retain it in your organisation, but two, you can pass it on to the new organisation, what needs to be passed on for the assets and the services that are going forward. I guess the real key in all this is that there's a lot of work in this, and the more you do from now, the easier you'll make it on your organisation. But you do need to allocate internal resources to this, and it's a really serious task you're going to have over the next 2 or 3 years to ensure that you make the right decisions, make informed decisions, and don't get to the end of the process and really rushing things in to get things into the machine, I guess, that's going to be working at central government, so that when you give them information, you really give them really good understanding what you've got, what you want, and those sort of things. Because if you do something in 2 or 3 weeks that you could probably spend 4 or 5 months on, you'll get a far better outcome by taking the 4 or 5 months to get everything right, and you'll be in a better position post reform if you do the hard yards over the next 3 years.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I think it sounds like, and it is indeed, a huge amount of work to do to make this all happen. But there is no doubt that it's been worthwhile, and the benefits do pay off. And it's so even though it sounds hard, it's well worth sticking with the process. So as Paul pointed out, we ended up with 3 water and sewerage corporations at a regional level with a common service provider, and that was then, pardon me, clearly a clumsy way of doing it. There's a lot of confusion in terms of how it works. The single entity that was created to sort of provide administrative support to the 3 regional corporations started to take on its own personality and was even looking for extra work to do and income sources. So the initiative actually to transition from the 3 regional bodies and the supporting corporation into one corporation emerged from within the 3 regional bodies that had been created. And so the idea of forming TasWater from those 4 corporations took root under the chairmanship of the then common chair for the 4 corporations. That did require legislative approval. The Water and Sewage Corporations Act had to be amended, and a number of other instruments had to change as well. On top of that, owner agreement was necessary. That took quite a while to broker, but once all the foundation pieces were put in place, the transition from the 3 operating corporations and the service providing corporation into TasWater was a very, very smooth process, and it came about with effect the 1st of July 2013. And in hindsight, clearly it would have been better to have gone to the one corporation straight up. It wasn't achievable politically, and so we had to go through this temporary transition moment of having transition to 4 corporations and then to 1. Earlier this year, the state government actually purchased 10% of Taswater, and in the process contributed $200 million to its working capital, and that's been a shot in the arm as well. What it's done actually is ensure very, very close collaboration between all the owners, the state government with 10%, and the 29 councils to focus the direction of Taswater to the benefit of all Tasmanians. And it's been something we are, certainly local government is very proud of. The state government is very pleased with the arrangement as it currently exists. They do have a slightly different ownership share arrangement. They have a special share, even though they've got 10% of the shareholding, and they've got 10% of the voting rights. When it comes to an equity vote around the table, they do not accept dividends, so all the dividends that flow from Taswater still go to local government. We recognise that there's been a lot of work, a lot of pain in the whole process, but the benefits are manifest and well worth going through all the hard work. And the bottom line, I think, is the top of the triangle here is compliance. When we started out, like New Zealand, we had problematic water supplies, people were getting sick, and we had a number of towns, 20-odd towns on boiled water alerts. Some towns couldn't consume the water at all because of lead poisoning and so on and so forth. Local government had no capacity to upgrade those systems. Some of the small regional councils that had these towns were limited in their resource revenue raising capability. And so once Taswater came along, got rolled up their sleeves and got into it, all of those towns that had problematic water supply have now been fixed. In fact, just this year, one of those towns has won the worldwide competition for the best domestic drinking water, and that's the town of Roadshow. And to go from boiled water alerts to the best drinking water in the world in a short number of years is just a remarkable achievement. Clearly, there have been environmental improvements. I've been talking about the water, drinking water, the potable water, but in terms of the sewage treatment, there have been marked improvements there. Taswater inherited, this might sound a bit strange, Tasmania, even though it's very small by international standards and national standards as a state, it's probably got the most distributed water and sewage system. We've got a huge number of water treatment plants, nearly 100 across the state, and each of those has been chugging away probably below, in many cases, certainly below environmental standards. And so Taswater has been able to consolidate some of these, certainly had the resources to upgrade them. And so the environmental improvements from the wastewater treatment point of view have been manifest as well. Clearly, you've now got a workforce which is clearly very focused and expert at managing water and sewage systems, whereas, for example, when that workforce working on water treatment plants and so on and so forth in local government, they were often multi-skilled across other aspects of council management as well. Safe systems, you've got a corporation that's large enough to ensure that the understanding of how to manage water and sewage systems safely is obviously there as well. It's just, pardon me, and I can go on. You've got a sustainable business model, you've got asset rationalisation and improvement, you've got customer satisfaction, and the charts we do measure, or Taswater does measure customer satisfaction, and that's been an incredible improvement as well. And built into the whole process, there's a it's just, in a nutshell, you've got a professional workforce managing the water and sewage business in Tasmania now. And a lot of that gets back to the skilled board, which is there. Looking at what went well, clearly the fact that we've got an expert board, the latest director that we recruited to the board, for example, was the previous managing director of Sydney Water, and previously on the board of managing director of Hunter Water in New South Wales. Another expert on the board is a previous Melbourne Water CEO. On top of that, the board has got expert financial people, of course. The board constitutes 7 people, the chair plus 6 directors. 4 of those are from the state overall, 3 are from the mainland. We've got diversity. Within the board, it's well balanced and clearly expert. I've talked about the boiled water notices. They've disappeared totally. You've got much more capital investment going. We look like spending $1 billion over the next 10 years. Rationalisation of infrastructure I've spoken about. When we talk about what didn't go well, I find it really hard to talk to these because I guess the common service provider, it took a long time to get there. We moved through the 3 corporations. It's taken some time to get the harmonisation of policies. That's certainly happened now. So these, what didn't go well, were part of the transition rather than and culture as well. They were transitional problems. They took a lot of work, but they have now got to the point where I would have to say they are pluses as well. So now we've got opportunities and challenges. The business of reshaping and refocusing service delivery is something that Taswater is clearly working on, upgrading its IT systems. Andrew spoke before about the difficulty of pulling together all the data and information and records that Taswater inherited from local government through 4 corporations. They are now going ahead in leaps and bounds. I know the board at the moment is starting to focus very much on what the next generation of IT looks like in terms of managing the business. Interestingly, a greater emphasis on funding of community assets. I think this is there's a debate just going on at the moment between the local government, the councils, and, for example, Taswater on irrigating sports grounds and things like that, and how we can do that more efficiently and cost effectively. And leveraging greater investment for community. I think the real opportunities here, we have 2 really major issues in terms of infrastructure, which both of them hundreds of millions of dollars. The Launceston scheme, there's a great overlap between the stormwater system and the sewage system, which results in significant pollution of the Tamar River, especially when heavy rainfall's there. We're talking about $150, $200 million project to clean all that up. Taswater is now, because it's one organisation, you've got the state government on board with the local government. We're able to work with the federal government for better funding on that, and also the balance sheet permits an opportunity for more investment there as well. So a problem that's been totally intractable in the past, there's now a light at the end of the tunnel on how that problem might be solved. So, and on top of that, clearly there are developers, challenges from developers and managing those. Andrew spoke about those as well. We are working on ways to improve that as well.
And obviously, post the reform, there are going to be impacts on local government. So you need to reshape your organisation and refocus where you're currently sitting. And I think we've talked a lot about that earlier on. So as Doug said, we're certainly happy to take questions on the impacts it is on the actual councils themselves and how you actually move forward. As far as future of local government in Tasmania is concerned, it's interesting that we are just entering a new phase of reform. And so the Minister just in the last couple of weeks has issued his view that there needs to be further local government reform. And his objectives is to create a more robust and compatible system of local government to meet the current and emerging needs of Tasmanian communities and to support Tasmania's recovery from the COVID pandemic. The review is to assess the performance of these roles across the sector in terms of effectiveness, sustainability and value to ratepayers. One thing that the Minister has said is that he doesn't see that this is necessarily will necessarily lead to amalgamations, but he also will not rule out that that's the case as well. So he is in the process currently of appointing an independent board, and my understanding is that that board will be appointed before Christmas this year. It will include 6 members, and they will have the role of, over the next 18 months, reviewing local government in Tasmania and the future of local government to take us into the next 50 years or so. So it's a 3-stage review. There's a community engagement and fact-finding process that will go from January to June next year. Stage 2 will be analysing all of the information and the options that have been gathered over that period. And then stage 3 is actually coming up with the recommended solutions. And it's expected that the final report will be provided to the Minister by June 2023. I was actually looking at some of the stuff that is currently happening in New Zealand and noticed that you've got Raising the Platform, and which is a review into the future of local government. And so I think having had a look through that document, there's a lot of similarities between what you're also going through and what we're about to commence on here in Tassie. So it's interesting that there's a fair bit of similarities between Tasmania and New Zealand. And I think that the one advantage, or the one issue that you've got, is that you're doing these things simultaneously. We've had a period of time where the water reform was dealt with. Now we're moving to the next stage, which is the local government reform. So that's why I think that the fact that you've got an extra 12 months to actually get the water reforms in place is certainly beneficial for the New Zealand context of where you're at.
Thanks so much, guys. Just getting into Q&A section, we've got our first question. It's come from Toyota. If that's how you pronounce it, I might have mispronounced it. Apologies for that. And the question is, how is Indigenous cultural views included or considered as part of the transition?
It certainly wasn't a big issue in Tasmania. It hasn't been raised by the Tasmanian Aboriginal groups, and so I don't think that it has the same level of impact, I suppose, or interest that you certainly have in New Zealand in relation to the Indigenous side of things. And certainly, I don't recall any comments whatsoever coming through around that sort of stuff as part of the water reform process.
And if I can just make a general statement, I think Australia has come a very long way. And we've had speakers in some previous sessions say actually Australia should look at how New Zealand is doing and learn from that. So we've had some of the panelists say that in previous sessions. Anything you want to add, Andrew, Doug, to that question?
No, certainly at the political level, it hasn't been an impact on this process at all.
Yep.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add.
Just another question I had. During the transition, you had a steering committee and an implementation task force. What was the difference between the task force and the steering committee? Paul, Andrew, or Doug, anyone?
Look, Paul may be in a better position to comment on this, but the steering group was more at the political level. The group below that was where the sleeves got rolled up and did all the hard work.
Yeah, and that's pretty right, actually. So there was the steering committee was the higher level group, and that was where there was the relationship between the state and local government, but the actual implementation groups is where the work was actually done. But the steering committee was also very important to make sure that they could actually oversee and make sure that the reporting that was being provided, particularly in that last 6 months, was the councils were actually meeting the timeframes and the requirements that they needed to do to actually get the reform and finished within the period so that the new corporations could start operating from the 1st of July 2009.
And I suppose just before I close, any closing comments, words of advice to us Kiwis before we, I suppose we already started the journey, but based on your experience, any closing comments and advice?
From my point of view, I think that you need to get to work and really make sure that you know what you're transferring. And you need to, from a CEO perspective and from the council perspective, look at what the future is going to be for your organisation post the reforms, because there's a lot of work that you need to do, particularly around refocusing the organisation. And depending on the level of how much of your workforce, for instance, is currently allocated to water and sewage, as to what impact that will have. A lot of those positions that are actually in councils in Tasmania at the time, a lot of the people worked across both water and sewage, but also all the other functions of councils. And you had to think about, well, what's that all going to look like post-reform? Because some of those people are no longer going to be within the organisation. I think Andrew mentioned before about some of the stuff around the people stuff is really important. Keeping the staff informed, keeping the people informed, keeping the community informed. There's all those things you need to be thinking about now to make sure that you can go along this journey, I suppose, and get a good outcome at the end of it. And don't underestimate the amount of work that's involved. I know that from the processes that we've been through with these webinars, we've sort of said, from my perspective, I wouldn't go back to the old way now. But at the time, I was from local government thinking, well, why does the state think they can do this better? It has certainly come to be, the evidence is that it is a much better outcome as a result of the water reform. So, don't waste the time you've got. And certainly look at how you're going to structure your organisations going forward, and make sure you only transfer what you need to transfer.
Thanks, Paul. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Burton. Look, I think as an organisation, you need to take a risk-based approach to this. And if the risk of water and sewage reform isn't in your register, it should be, because and while there might be politics going on and resistance and those sort of things, you've still got to have it in your risk register. It's a risk that's going to happen, so you need to start preparing for it. So I guess I'd put a message to CEOs really is to say, take a risk-based approach to this. You need to start thinking about it and preparing, because if you don't put the hard yards in as soon as you can, you'll be left short and you won't get the best outcome for your communities. And that's what's pretty important, whether it's the council at the end of the day or whether it's a water entity. At the end of the day, what's most important to local government, I think, is the communities they represent. So to give it justice, whilst there might be another 6 months of politics to go on or 12 months, don't sit back and wait for that to happen before you think you need to get in and do something. Do it today. That's my final word on that. I think that's really critical, is that just don't wait. Start thinking about it. Start like I say, risk-based approach, get it in your risk register. How are we going to manage this? What happens if it does happen? What if it doesn't happen? All those sort of questions should be asked around the executive tables today. Yeah. Thanks, Burton.
Thank you, Andrew. Doug?
Yeah, look, I'll start off by saying it is a lot of hard work, but it's worth the journey. At the political level, I think it's really important that you recognise that you're going through a negotiation process, a deal-making process, and you have to remain vigilant to ensuring that your rights and your expectations are met along the way, that there's not mission creep and things don't turn out the way you want them to. That ongoing vigilance is essential, and I'd encourage you to do that, but certainly not shy away from the reform. I think it's really important.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Andrew. And with that, we'll wrap up. This is our last session this side of Christmas. So everyone who's been participating in the webinars, have a safe and Merry Christmas. Thank you.